In this New World Aeternum Greatsword build guide, we'll focus on the Greatsword, which is a phenomenal melee weapon. This weapon plays equally well with Strength or Dexterity, meaning that you can take either Strength or Dexterity and look at the passive attributes of those stats and determine which you want more, and kind of head down that line. However, since the best bonuses for both Strength and Dexterity are further in their stat lines, I recommend focusing on either Strength or Dexterity early on, and only putting extra points in Strength or Dexterity, whichever one you didn't use early on later, when you have more points. By far, one of the best things about the Greatsword is the fact that it scales well with both Strength and Dexterity, making it equally viable to be paired with other Strength scaling weapons or other Dexterity scaling weapons, or even other weapons that scale with both Strength and Dexterity, like the Sword and Shield. That means if you really like the moveset of the Greatsword, but you also want to use something kind of dexterous like the Rapier or maybe the Hatchet, or even if you want to pair it with like a musket or a bow to get some range, you can. Or maybe you want to use it with Sword and Shield, or you want to use it with a Great Axe or Warhammer just to have a variety of attacks. For instance, the Warhammer is very good at stunning. You could stun and then switch to the Greatsword. The unique thing about the Greatsword is its Onslaught stance and Defiance stance features. Using abilities from the Onslaught skill tree will put you into Onslaught stance, which increases your damage dealt, but also your damage taken, and reduces your charged heavy attack time by half. This is an offensive stance that's good for dealing damage with no regard to defense, so this could be very good for like questing, for instance, or maybe in small-scale PvP situations where you're not surrounded by a lot of enemies. Or maybe even if you're playing the DPS role in expeditions. Defiance stance, on the other hand, reduces both your damage taken and your damage dealt, and makes you auto-block when charging your heavy attack. This is, of course, a defensive stance, and is good for increasing your protection, for instance, if you're surrounded by a large number of enemies, or maybe you're in a medium to large scale PvP and you need to protect yourself, or maybe even if you're tanking in a expedition. Note that these stances last for 10 seconds from the time of your last skill, so you'll be in them quite often when using a Greatsword, but do note that if you swap weapons, they will be removed, and that when you're beginning combat, it'll usually have been a while since your last stance, so you probably won't have a stance for your first attack. Because the Greatsword is such a great melee weapon with wide horizontal light attacks that can cleave multiple enemies, you'll likely use it in one of two ways. You'll use it paired with a ranged weapon to allow you to hit enemies as they approach before swapping to it, or you'll use it as a weapon for tanking in expeditions paired with something like Sword and Shield, since two of Defiance skills generate threat. These are of course not the only ways you can use this weapon, but they're generally the ways that I think most people playing the Greatsword will play. The pros of this weapon type are that it's great for hitting multiple enemies. It can be played aggressively or defensively, giving you versatility in the style of play that you're using. It can heal itself through damage with one of its capstones, and it can be paired with any strength or dexterity scaling weapon effectively, and doubly effectively with strength and dexterity scaling weapons like Sword and Shield. The cons are that it's quite heavy for a weapon, not unlike the Warhammer or Great Axe, and that getting used to the stances can take some time. And taking a look at the Greatsword skill trees of Onslaught, Defiance, when you look at Onslaught, you can tell immediately that this skill tree is all about improving the damage that you deal and increasing your damage. So if you're trying to get the most damage out of your Greatsword, you're going to focus predominantly on this skill tree. The Defiance skill tree, on the other hand, is all about reducing the damage that you take, as well as improving your block in order to make you block more effectively, which is fantastic for medium to large scale PvP, one-on-one PvP, or even expeditions where you might be tanking a dungeon. So taking a look at the Onslaught skill tree first, the first ability is Relentless Rush. This dashes you through foes while spinning, hitting 2 times, and applying slow to enemies hit. This skill is really good for AoEing down groups of enemies or players when they're all kind of bundled up, like if you're in a dungeon and they're all around your tank, or maybe if you're questing and you've pulled a lot of enemies, or again in PvP, if there's a small to medium-sized group bundled up with players, you can just spin right through them and slow them all. Now, when you upgrade this skill, you're going to get increased damage from Empower, and you will also be able to make it so that if you use it from Onslaught stand, you'll root targets, which is probably better in PvP than PvE. And you'll also make it so that when you hit targets coming from Defiance stance, you'll actually heal yourself for 15% of the damage dealt. This is far better in my opinion. So I think if you really like this skill, it would benefit you to put at least one Defiance skill on your bar and try and time this after that skill. Additionally, if you kill a target with this weapon skill, you'll actually reduce its cooldown by 50%. I don't know how often this is likely to occur. It might occur depending on like whether you're questing or dungeoning. But generally, you're going to be trying to use the skill every time it's off cooldown, regardless of how much health the target has. You might even lead with it, depending on how many targets there are. So this is great, but I doubt you're going to like rely on this to trigger this regularly. The next skill we're going to take a look at is Crosscut. This will do like 2 crossing slashes before like a follow-up overhead slice. And its final hit does considerably extra damage. The second hit is even more than the first hit. So it kind of does more damage as you go into the chain, and I honestly wouldn't even recommend using this skill until you have its first upgrade that gives you grit, because you could easily be interrupted when using this skill. And the final upgrade of this weapon skill actually increases the damage of the last hit if you hit a target below 50% health, or 75% if you're already in Onslaught stance from using an Onslaught skill. So this means that you don't want to use it like lead off with it in combat. You'll probably want to use like Relentless Rush first, then hopefully drop the target below 75% with that attack, or maybe a light attack, then Relentless Rush, and then use this skill to try and get the most out of it, assuming you can land that last hit. So the final skill in the Onslaught tree is Skyward Slash, and this kind of like does like a slash upward that when upgraded allows you to do a follow-up attack that deals damage, and this applies a rend to the target and staggers them, and when fully upgraded also diseases the target. And this is a skill that can be kind of hard to use because it has a really long animation. The disease is obviously aimed more at PvP than PvE, where it'll debuff the healing of a player, but this skill can be really hard to use in PvP because of its long animation. The capstone for this skill tree, Unrelenting Onslaught, reduces the cooldown of your Greatsword skills by 2% for light attacks and 10% for charged heavy attacks. And this sounds a lot better on paper than it is in practice, I think, because usually if you're questing, you're going to kill a target before you can really get enough out of this. Like, you'll just blow through your skills on that target, kill them, move on to the next target, and repeat. And, you know, doing a couple light attacks isn't really going to make a difference, or even a charged heavy attack's not going to make enough of a difference. So I don't think this one is quite as good. So moving on to the Defiance skill tree, the first skill is Steadfast Strike. This kind of stabs forward and then kind of like spins in a slash. And this skill staggers and pulls the foe, but also generates threat. So if you're like wanting to tank in a dungeon, this is a good way to grab threat on a boss. It also restores 20 stamina per enemy hit, which is fantastic. You need stamina when tanking, and it's also good in PvP, so it's good in both of those scenarios. And you can upgrade this skill to heal you if you hit with the first hit, as well as set bleeding if you're in Defiance stance already, and also to reduce the cooldown of your other Greatsword skills if you hit with this ability. Calamity Counter allows you to automatically block for 2 seconds, reducing the amount of stamina damage that you're going to take while blocking by 90%, and then unleash a counter attack that, you know, staggers the enemy or knocks them back depending on how many blocks that you've done. This is really, really good for tanking multiple enemies in a dungeon, or maybe in mid to high big level PvP where you might be facing multiple enemies, or even if you like questing where you just pull lots of enemies at once. Can be good in either of those 3 scenarios. You can upgrade this skill to do bleeding when you counterattack, and also increase its critical strike chance when countering, and then further increase that if you do it from Onslaught stance, or if you use this from Defiance stance to heal yourself. And this can be great when paired with like an Onslaught build, for instance, where maybe you use this ability and then you use Relentless Rush that will then heal you because you're in Defiance stance, and then you follow that up with Crosscut, and then you follow it up with this ability again that then gains a benefit to critical strike chance from using Crosscut before it. So there's like a nice synergy there depending on what skills you're using. And the last skill in this skill tree is Roaring Rupture, which stabs your sword into the ground that does like a shockwave and an AoE around you that deals damage. It increases your protection and also generates threat on all enemies around you. So this is really great for tanking. Once you upgrade this, you can make it so it cleanses 2 debuffs from you, which is also great for tanking, but realistically, you might lead off with this when tanking. And then you also make it so that you weaken targets, which reduces the damage they deal, which is great for PvP or PvE, and you become uninterruptible for 5 seconds. So if you use this, like going into a dungeon pull, then you're going to be able to like keep swinging afterward without getting interrupted, or if you're PvPing, you use this on a bunch of players, and then you can keep attacking. Great. And the final upgrade allows you to push targets away from you or pull targets into you, depending on what you're trying to do. Generally in PvP, you might be trying to push them away, but you might also be able to pull them towards you, so you can group them up for your ranged players to nuke them down, or you might be pulling, you know, enemies towards you to group them up in order to AoE them down easier as well. The capstone for this skill tree is Undying Defiance. This makes it so you passively heal for 5% of your damage, which is great, and also increases that amount to 15% for a little bit after blocking an attack. This is the better of the 2 capstones in my opinion, because when you're out questing, you're just be healing yourself from attacking. If you're PvPing, this might give you an edge while you're healing yourself while attacking. Might give you enough to just finish off another player without having to pop a heal, or they might have to play defensively for a bit while you're not. And also when tanking, just giving yourself a little bit more healing in a dungeon, it takes a little bit of pressure off your healer. One passive skill in this skill tree I want to bring your attention to before we move on, though, is the arrow deflection skill, which allows you to block 100% of projectile damage that's headed your way. And this is particularly important if you're a PvP player playing in New World Aeternum because of the lock-on feature being added to the game. This can allow you to approach players that are ranging at you and block all the damage that they deal, making it invaluable. So highly recommend that if you're planning to PvP. So that kind of wraps up my video on the Greatsword. I hope you guys found it useful. This is a weapon that you can pair with a ranged weapon if you like to play a mix of range and melee styles like I do. You can pair it with another strength or dexterity based weapon, allowing you to really have a playstyle that's maybe different than some other weapons in the game because of the scaling of this weapon. You can be wielding a greatsword 1 minute and a rapier the next, and play nimbly and dodge and then pull out a greatsword and go ham, or however you want. There are just so many different ways to play with greatsword because it can match so well with so many different weapons. Stay tuned because we have more New World build guides coming, as well as other guides for the game. Are you going to be playing Greatsword at the launch of New World Aeternum? Are you going to be playing something else? What are you pairing it with? Let me know in the comments below.